There are over 1,600 recorded invasive weed species in the Pacific. They affect ecosystems by impacting on native biodiversity, including endangered, endemic or iconic species, ecosystem resilience, and they further facilitate invasion of non-native species. They impact on our health and safety, the health and safety of our animals, our food security, and they reduce our incomes and livelihoods. They limit how we can move around in our environment and impact on our leisure activities, our access to species with beneficial and cultural uses. They can contribute to greater impacts from natural disasters such as fires, floods, cyclones and landslides, and in turn, damage critical infrastructure. Weeds are slowly changing the very fabric of our ecosystems, communities, and lives. Talofa, I'm David Mobley, the Invasive Species Advisor for SPREC, and welcome to our fourth Battler Lounge event, Weeds or Resilience, Restoring Nature's Services.
Things like clean water, breakdown and removal of waste, habitats, all of these things are services provided by ecosystems. So something like the invasion of a weed can disrupt the way that whole community operates. Once a weed has covered more than a hectare of land, your chances of eradicating it are pretty much zero. The great thing about using natural enemies is that once you have them in place, they work for free. They don't cost anything. They work 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year.
Tamalingi was a major problem during Cyclone Evan because they were easily breaking and they were easily carried down by the rivers, and they blocked a lot of roads and bridges, infrastructures, and then it spread down to the village and destroyed a lot of families, low-lying villages.
Tamalingi is likely to exacerbate flooding issues because it can easily uproot during cyclones. Its debris will add fuel to the floodwater, causing blockages to riverways and destructions to infrastructures and properties.
Controlling Tamalingi will increase the resilience of the communities in Samoa. Because the less Tamalingi that we have, the more potential of our native trees to grow.
It is not enough to get rid of Tamalingi. It's one of God's creations, and it's valuable in some ways for our environment. But authorities should seriously concentrate on reinstating Samoa's native ecosystem.
I think the plant we're calling devil's ivy in Niue is probably the scariest weed I have ever seen.
It's just expanding so much that it's encroaching onto not only the forest but also agriculture, farming lands.
So the only way to get rid of it is scorched earth. You have to remove everything, and then you've got your bare ground and more weeds can invade.
It's just encroached onto rainforest and also conservation areas. So a lot of the vegetation, a lot of the trees we have noticed that they are just dying because of these taro vines.
So if we can't come up with some better methods for controlling it, such as the use of natural enemies, it has the potential to completely destroy things like native forests.
Also, the food that's provided from our forest will be impacted both in quality and quantity, and will only get worse if we do not do anything to get this problem under control. And also, they destroy habitats for some of our key biodiversity species, such as the coconut crab.
We have tried chemicals, we have tried slash and burn. We've also, at the moment, using heavy machinery as a way to contain the area.
So taro vine is too widespread and will take a huge workforce over a few years, at least contain the spread of taro vine. And for us here in Niue, this is no longer an option. So a healthy and strong forest ecosystem will increase climate resilience for not only our environment, but also the people of Niue.
We need a collaborative approach when it comes to invasive species eradication. Climate change has really highlighted the need to work together, and we need resources that can provide a greater impact on the ground.
At the moment, there's very limited research on taro leaf vine. There also hasn't been any strong or consolidated effort to develop a biocontrol program for this weed, and it's already present and causing havoc in many of the Pacific countries.
In regards to immediate impacts, we need eradication, physical eradication, but at the same time, long term, we still need biocontrol.
What we underestimate with weeds is that there are hundreds of species and the problem is getting worse, but slowly. So we don't necessarily notice the change over time. So we do know with climate change, with increasing CO2, with increasing temperature, that is going to make some weeds more invasive. That means they're going to grow faster and have harmful impacts, even more severe than what we see now. Countries can do something about climate change and invasive species. Taking on weeds using natural enemies is very doable. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It doesn't require expensive equipment. It is something we can do.
There's some major impacts there in Niue and Samoa. I've witnessed both of those myself, and to be honest, they are a lot more horrifying in real life than on film. I'd like to welcome two of my colleagues into the Battler Lounge with me now. We have Mr. Joseph Pesce here with me. He is the PISM's associate, and Ms. Bella Rash, who is the coordinator for the Jeff 6 project. The segments in that movie from Samoa, quite a lot of us were here in Samoa in 2012 with Cyclone Evan. It was a big event. I know, Joseph, you were working on Mount Via at the time with DEC. What must have had a devastating impact on the biodiversity where you were working?
Yes, thanks, Dave, for the question. Indeed, that was the case on Mount Via when we were trying to restore the forest. We had, an inventory survey that was done from 2007 to 2010, and that survey indicated 60% of the forest was invasive. And then after Cyclone Evan in 2012, we went back to the site after 1 year. And the result was it was really bad because we found out that the whole forest is covered by 90% of invasive species.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's a pretty serious issue. And I think in the sense that tamalingi is a widespread weed, and also they break and fall easily. So not only that affects the catchment areas, but also it has the effect on other surrounding vegetation, mainly our native species. When they fall, they cause damage to those surrounding native species. So it's a really severe tree that we should consider.
And that's in areas where a lot of people don't go and would never even see those impacts.
Yeah, definitely. That's the
What about you, Bella? I'm not sure where you were in 2012. I hadn't met you at that stage.
Yeah, I don't think I was out of, I was in the working space, but I do remember from our family experience in 2012, Cyclone Evan, we didn't have any water for a really long time, much longer after the cyclone was done. And this is because of fallen tamalingi trees that impacted our water system. So we have, back at home, we have a independent water scheme. So the village looks after it, and the fall of the tamalingi trees, the surge had broken our water intake. So it was about a month of fetching water, and those are kind of the impacts of invasive species on Pacific livelihoods that a lot of us don't make these connections to, but they're really substantive in the lives of our communities.
Yeah, it's not like in some of the larger countries where they can just bring in big machinery and clean
Clear
things
it out,
up
absolutely.
and pull in 100 workers to fix it, is it?
Yeah, very, very difficult, Dave.
Wow. Well, thanks for that. Bella is going to run some questions with us as we go through today's Battler Lounge. We use an app called Mentimeter. And I'll hand it over to Bella to let you know how to use that, and we'll be using that at regular stages throughout the Battler Lounge today.
Thanks, Dave. I think this is an excellent tool to engage our participants, and with the help of Wayne, who is our IT person, we are going to go through a brief introductory questions and then cover just the first part of our presentation on weeds awareness. So Wayne, if you can help me share our first slide, and if you can open up your phones or a laptop that you're not using to join, and use a web browser to go onto the URL on the screen, www.menti.com. And when you've loaded that URL, it will prompt you for a code. So on there is our code, 620-24814. And I don't know if you two want to join as well, and we can kind of do this activity together if you have your
that
phones.
Sounds like a great idea, Bella.
Great.
I always need a few extra things to keep me busy.
Fantastic. So we've got some reactions already. That's fantastic. If we can go on to our next slide. So Talofa lava. We're joining from Samoa, and if you could please send us a greeting in your language so we can get you introduced onto this platform.
What's the code there? It's too slow.
Wayne, if you can please move the panel and we can share the code.
Catch up on the next one.
So if you have missed the code in the first session, please just see the top of the slide. It's got both the URL direction as well as the code, if you've missed the first one.
Quite a lot of people from New Zealand, Bella.
Yeah, they're taking up that
That's the thing.
space, huh? So this is a really cool tool. The more responses that are of the same, that's how you measure the size of the greeting. So obviously on the screen, we've got Bula Vinaka and Kia ora and Talofa as our main greeting that's been sent in. But we've also got some other ones, Kia ora tātou, and some greetings from Wellington, Talofa lava, and Malo te kātaki. We've got some Tongan greetings there, Dave.
Yeah.
Yep, I think
Cook
everyone's,
Islands.
yeah,
Looks like some Kiwis, g'day. Maybe they're Australians.
perhaps we'll find out in the next session. What country are you joining us from today? So Dave, Joseph, and I obviously are joining from Sprit, which is in Samoa. Oh, you're right, Dave. We've got some Cook Island greetings and Australia. Joyce, we see some of our counterparts from Wallis and Futuna.
Yeah, that's
as
great.
well.
It's great to see member countries from the French territories.
They're not just great on the rugby field, they're also into natural enemies. It's great to see.
Are we talking about Samoa there, Dave?
No,
Oh.
Wallace and Futuna are the current providers of English rugby champions, if you haven't been following the news.
Thank you, everybody. We'll now go to our next slide. What organization, department are you representing today? So like the previous slides, please enter onto the text box provided. Got a couple of regional organizations there from the University of South Pacific, FAO, but we've also got some national NGOs. So we have our friends from BIPA, Dave, who are joining.
Hello.
And our Wallis and Futuna Territorial Environment Department.
Very nice.
Yeah, National University of Samoa and the University of New South Wales are also present.
Got some prisons partners with us, of course.
Yeah. Oh, we look like we've got a nice wide range of partners and organizations joining us, and thank you very much for making the time. We will now go on to our last introductory question before we start our NENS awareness review. So this question is really trying to collect our data of participants with age and gender, Joe. So I'm sure, we'll have a lot of the, which one do you think is going to be the popular one today, Joe?
I guess I'll just wait for the results to come out. It seems like we don't have any youth male joining us.
Yes,
Oh, well, right there.
Moving up 3%.
Fantastic.
Great to see the female dominating this session, it seems.
It's certainly not the case right now, but it is with the attendance. So I'm really, really glad to see that result. Thank you very much, everyone. And we will now move on to our next assessment question.
Thank you, Bella, and thank everyone for joining us in those exercises. That might seem fairly menial, the first one, but we will be collecting some information which will be really meaningful for us later on in the session. In the first video, we heard quite a bit about using natural enemies or biocontrol to help manage weeds, but what are they and how do they actually work? There's a lot of stories out there and a lot of potentially misinformation. It can be quite complex, but it is actually rather simple. And our friends at the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, or the HISC, and their coordinating group on alien pest species, which they call GCAPS in Hawaii, have put together a little bit of an animation, which we thought was really good. And it talks about what biocontrol agents or natural enemies are and how we can use them. So let's have a look at that movie.
Invasive plants and pests can be tough to control once they are too widespread. But some invasive species cause so much damage that something has to be done. Biocontrol is a way to help control an invasive species using living organisms. In the past, biocontrol may have been seen as risky, likely because in 1883, mongoose were brought to Hawaii by sugar plantations to control rats. But back then, there were no laws to control imports, nor any requirements for testing potential impacts. So over the years, new laws helped make biocontrol safer and more targeted. As an example of how biocontrol is used today, let's look at how a caterpillar can deal with one of Hawaii's worst invasives, Myconia. Myconia is originally from Central America, where it has to compete with other fast-growing tree species. And there are many insects, fungi, and parasites that help to keep Myconia's growth in check. But when Myconia was brought to Hawaii, those organisms didn't come with it. That allowed Myconia trees to dominate and smother Hawaiian forests. Researchers wanted to find a way to reduce Myconia's dominance, so they went back to its home to find insects and parasites that evolved with it. They found a caterpillar and its adult butterfly that were not eating other types of plants, so they brought them to a secure laboratory. They were placed in cages with a range of plants they might come across in Hawaii. They were tested to ensure that they will only eat Myconia and will not survive without it. The Myconia caterpillar passed all these tests, so it's called host-specific. The caterpillar doesn't kill Myconia, but reduces the plant's ability to dominate, which helps the watershed and native species. Since 1975, more than 50 host-specific biocontrols have been reunited with their invasive species hosts, bringing balance without causing impacts to other species. Biocontrol isn't always the solution, but when done right, can provide long-term, cost-effective, and natural control. A biocontrol has even saved our native wili trees from extinction. To learn more about biocontrol in Hawaii, visit biocontrolhawaii.org.
Well, there you go. So it's not that complicated, is it?
No, it isn't.
It is something that has to be done very well and under strict testing and protocols. It actually looks like a very safe solution that could be used in the Pacific. But actually, it has been around for quite a long time in the Pacific. I think people have just forgotten about biocontrol. Maybe because the solutions that it was providing are no longer needed. You don't see those weeds anymore, perhaps. But natural enemies have been used in the Pacific since 1911. There's actually 67 natural enemies that have been introduced and to control 26 weed species. And there's 17 Pacific Island countries and territories that have deliberately introduced natural enemies. 18 weed species are under control in at least one country, providing long-term benefits to communities, which is fantastic. We're going to have a new type of session this Battle Lounge. It's one we've planned to have in the past. We move our sessions around a little bit. We try and keep them consistent. This one is a bit of a flashback. So sometimes it's really good to have a look back at the past. As we were just saying, people forget about things. And this has been going on for a long time. But even 40 years ago, there's an incredible story that was told back then, and perhaps people haven't heard that story for a long time. But a beetle was introduced to the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea in 1982, which was 40 years ago, to control an invasive waterweed called Salvinia. And the Australian research team, that quite a long documentary back then, and our partners have cut that down for us to have a look back to 40 years ago and see what they were doing then. And I think we'll all be surprised how it was and how it went.
The Sepik River, one of the largest in Papua New Guinea. It rises in the country's western highlands and flows through the heart of the East Sepik province. The lagoon shores are home to many people who rely on the waterways for communication, transport, and food. Even in its more modern aspects, the whole fabric of Sepik life revolves around the river. Then, in just a few brief years, something happened that tore that fabric apart. It was a plant that lived in the water. At first, it was just a nuisance. Soon, it became a menace, clogging water intakes and fouling the propellers of outboard motors. All too quickly, it became a disaster. This is Salvinia. It's not a flowering plant, but a water fern. But let it loose, and it's the stuff of nightmares. Here, the Salvinia was a metre thick and could support a man's weight. This is Salvinia infestation at its worst, a seemingly impossible situation. Scientists had sought Salvinia's native range for a decade and failed. Then in 1979, during a routine survey of a quiet river in southern Brazil, that search came to an end. The weed was very restricted, living on quiet backwaters. 3 insects were found living on it: a moth, a grasshopper, and a small black weevil. Careful tests confirmed the weevil attacked only Salvinia. It would die rather than eat anything else. It had perfect credentials for a biological control agent. The weevils themselves were holding the weed in check. If the Salvinia multiplies, so do the weevils, causing it to decline. The weevils have no choice but to follow. This is biological control at its most perfect, a marriage between the host and its natural enemy that neither can dissolve. No further human intervention is needed. The solution is permanent. Dr. Peter Room of CSIRO's Division of Entomology made the first release of the weevils on Lake Mundara, the main water supply for the inland city of Mount Isa. The results were dramatic. The local villagers showed a keen interest in Peter's previous successes.
This is Lake Mundara before we put the beetles on, and you can see that there's a very solid cover of Salvinia there. And then this is the same shot as the first one, about 11 months afterwards, and you can see the same hills there.
It was decided to give the weevils a try. Returning to Australia, Peter Room went weevil collecting. Room would take only a few hundred insects with him, a mere thimbleful, and one of the most unusual forms of foreign aid ever to leave Australia. Room arrived at Wewak Airport, carrying a biological revolution in his briefcase.
I hope you've brought plenty of beetles with you.
Yep, they're all in here.
Good.
The weevil's life cycle begins with adults feeding on new Salvinia buds above the water's surface. Aided by air bubbles sticking to their bodies, the weevils lay eggs on submerged stems. The larvae hatch and further damage the plant by boring through the stems and eating more buds. The larvae then pupate, before emerging as new weevils to repeat the cycle. And so, in February 1982, 600 pinhead-sized weevils were given the task of destroying some 250 square kilometers of weed. The picture changed dramatically. It was as if a fuse had been lit. The weevil population exploded. The Wewak radio station broadcast the good news and asked villagers to collect weevil-infested weed and take it back to their weed-infested lagoons. As quickly as it was disrupted in the late 1970s, life on the Sepik is returning to normal. The lagoons and lakes will never be completely free of Salvinia, but the weed should no longer be a problem. By the end of the decade, the world's worst water weed will once more be relegated into obscurity.
Wow, what a result. I'm
Great
sure
stuff.
we'd all like to have results like that, wouldn't we?
Yeah,
And that was 40 years ago.
a long time
Yeah.
ago.
That speaks volumes to how far back the names have been in place, but somehow a lot of people have forgotten about it. And probably because they are the silent killers. And it takes time to see the results. So I guess probably that's why people tend to forget about it. But it's good that we're reviving that.
Yeah, and apparently the Australian research team that did that work won a UNESCO prize for their work and also the benefits that it provided to the community there. So it's amazing, and it's still working 40 years later.
Prize well deserved, if you ask me.
Absolutely. Well, we've got some more Mentimeter questions for everybody. So I pass it back to Bella. Hopefully you've still got your phone open at Mentimeter.
Thank you very much, Dave. We're picking up from our second segment of this assessment, and the first one is based on weed awareness. So if you do have your phones, please refresh, and it should be able to take you back to the last slide that we left things off on. So, and if you haven't, a kind reminder that the URL is www.menti.com with the code on the top side of the screen. We'll just give a couple of minutes for that, and for me, who's logging on as well, and then we'll make a start.
My one has a red heart on it, Bella. What does that mean?
It signals to us that you're now on and you can see the questions.
So there's
All right.
a lot of blue hearts and green hearts popping out there.
Yeah, we've got lots of people on, so we'll now move on. Our first question is, do you think invasive weeds are getting enough attention currently compared to other environmental issues?
That's a tough question. There's a lot of environmental issues out there. I think personally, from my experience, that people, they're probably not as often seen. They don't eat your food directly. So the effects are sometimes not as obvious as things like rats.
Definitely. You know, like you mentioned, Dave, there's so many other competing issues that tend to overshine this very, very important issue that needs to be addressed. And as you can see from the responses, no is, it takes up 90% of what people think. People think that no, invasive species, invasive weeds are not getting enough attention.
I'd imagine that the people in PNG would agree with that, but maybe not now.
Absolutely. No more worry of the waterweed. Next slide, please. So this one is asking for you to choose the top 3 answers of what you think are the main problems caused by invasive weeds in your country. So we've got a couple there. Joseph, which one is yours? Maybe not. Which one is your top one of the options there?
Yeah, I guess this really comes down to what people prioritize, and I guess the impact to everyone is different.
Yeah.
We see quite a lot of people saying that it reduces biodiversity, which is one case, but I think all of the 5 impacts people in certain ways.
Yeah.
That's my take.
And you're absolutely right. You know, the impacts are really, really broad from the responses and the experiences both, you know, you, Dave, myself, and Joe had from Cyclone Evan and the impact of the Taumalini from those case studies. And we see here a lot of the responses really go back and agree with biodiversity. But, you know, there is a fair choice with economic impacts as well.
Yeah,
Our least one here is health risks.
Yeah, I guess it depends also which plant you're talking about, because some provide risks to health and others impact biodiversity, while others are bad for agriculture. And some of them are bad for everything. So it's quite a fairly balanced view up there, I would have thought.
Yeah. So our next question is, what are the 3 worst invasive weeds that you have in your country at present? Joseph, you're going to choose the Taumalini, right?
I think I'll go with the African tulip.
Right.
Because you know, its impact, they are potential transformers for the environment. So I think over time the impact will gradually build up, and it'll eventually change the whole face of the forest.
Dave, what's your pick on this one?
I don't know if I should give away my 3, but again, it depends. Weeds impact different things. For me, obviously, I'm biased. I'm mostly interested in protecting the environment, so that's going to influence what I would say are my favorite, my worst 3. But yeah, so I hate the taro vine. I've spent quite a bit of time in Niue with Huggett and the guys there. I know what it takes to control it manually and with herbicides, and it's not a pretty picture for the amount that's there. So that's definitely, I think, one of my terrible weeds. And I know how widespread it is in the Pacific, but it's yet to be recognised as a weed.
Well, our
So I think
participants certainly agree with you to identify that as a weed, with taro vine being one of the top 4 species that have been identified. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for your responses. We will now move on to our next question, which asks you for 3 responses again. And this one is targeted to your thoughts on the main barriers that prevent us from properly addressing invasive weeds in the Pacific Islands region. So our answers, Joseph, as you can see on the screen, is it ranges from the inability of decision makers to understand why they are a problem, or up to the other end where it's just not seen as a priority, even though some of the problems are recognized in this. Can you tell us about, what your experiences are on, the maybe misunderstandings that some communities might have on invasive weeds?
Yes, I guess the greatest misunderstanding is that not reading through the facts and getting the right information to learn about what actually works. Because in Samoa, personally, we tend to have that, we tend to go against biocontrol because of the impacts that it had to our country in the past. For example, the introduction of the miner.
Absolutely.
But that sort of paints the wrong picture for us. But in terms of biocontrol for weeds, it's totally scientific proof. So and I think people should really get back to that mindset that biocontrol actually do the work for us. We can go to sleep and they can do the work for us.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Joe. So you'll see from the responses here that the most voted barrier is that invasive, the addressing of invasive weeds is not seen as a priority. So that's something that's really interested to look into why, and how we can address that. Obviously not in this session, because we would be here all day if we were trying to address that, but it's definitely something we can have conversations on in the future. And our next question now. So I've got 2 sections. This is the last one. Thank you very much for your participation so far. This one is on NEN's awareness. So we want to know how many natural enemies have been successfully released in your countries, if any. So Joe, do you know how many have been released in Samoa, or is Samoa looking into it if we haven't had a successful release of biocontrol agents here?
That information is still forthcoming, and like I mentioned before, we had a PRISMS a PMC or management course that we had in 2019, and surprisingly, most of us from Samoa don't really know if there's any natural enemies in the country. So yeah, it's information is still forthcoming on that. And so, yeah.
Fantastic. So we've got
of not sures.
Yes, I was just about to point that out, Dave.
I'm very happy to tell you that we can solve this problem for you today, but you're going to have to wait and see how it's done.
All right, I think I'll wait too, because I'm not sure how many Samoa's received either, Joe.
Yeah.
So our next question. Again, if you could please provide us your top 3 answers on what you think are the keys to generating public support for biocontrol measures. So this is actually a really, really interesting one, Jill, because in the previous questions we had why it wasn't getting, why invasive weeds wasn't getting addressed. And now we're going to answer that the popular response that people gave, which was invasive species or invasive weeds were not being seen as a priority. So here, I feel like the responses from here will be really helpful to address these kind of challenges that we have.
Yeah, and I can see that there's a lot of people leaning towards having greater public education about the benefits and safety or low risk of biocontrol methods, which is great.
Yeah, and celebrating success stories again, Dave. You talked about how, the success of what happened in Papua New Guinea. It happened so long ago, but not a lot of people know about it, talk about it, or remember. So, that point of celebrating our success stories and telling that story is really, really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like anything, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Someone talks about a great movie, you want to watch it.
Next question. Thank you very much. This is actually a really, really interesting conversation we're having. We're now moving on to what you think would be the best way to demonstrate a successful biocontrol program for weeds in the Pacific by the year 2030. And Joe, do you want to talk about what you think would be the best way to demonstrate this?
I guess if I have to decide from the list up there, I would totally go for increased number of invasive weed management plans using natural enemies. That's my take on that question.
Yeah, awesome. But also our popular one here is the decrease of widespread weeds in the region by 2030. It's not too far off if you're thinking of years of, doing the work as NINs, because like, you have said, Dave, and like all the sessions have shown us, it definitely doesn't happen overnight.
No, although I am told that in the tropical Pacific, things happen a lot faster because life cycles of things move faster, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, there's a lot of information about, more information about how successful they can be with a lot of our assets that we have online, which we'll point people to later on in the session.
Thank you for that. And now moving on to our next question. Oh, no, it's the end of our presentation. Let's not get too excited. We'll save this for our last session, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, Bella. So our next session we're on to is Creature Feature. If you remember back to our Battler Lounge in December, we had a really close-up look at rats, which was absolutely amazing. The reason we have a Creature Feature session all the time for the Battler Lounge is we love to learn a little bit more about some of the species that most of us have to deal with. And today is certainly just like that. And I'm going to ask Joseph to give us a little bit of a lead-in to what our Creature Feature is today, because as he said earlier, he alluded to that this might be his most horrific weed.
Thank you, Dave. So our Creature Feature for today will be African tulip. And this is because it causes most harm to the forest, as I experienced with the work on Mount Maya. And, when I mentioned before that there's a great potential for this species to transform the vegetation, the forest stands. So I guess it's about time now for Pacific countries to start investing in NIN's work, because we know that they are already beyond our reach in terms of their distribution, but also they are quite expensive to deal with using the regular methodologies that we are used to. So next up, we have the Creature Feature video for you.
Kia ora. My name is Quentin Painter, and I'm a research scientist working on invasive species based at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research in Auckland, New Zealand. And today I'm going to talk about African tulip tree. African tulip tree, or Spathodia campanulata to give its scientific name, is a fast-growing evergreen tree that's indigenous to Central and Western Africa. It can grow up to 24 metres tall and has very attractive orange-red flowers. During the 1930s, African tulip trees were introduced to many Pacific islands as an ornamental plant, but unfortunately they jumped the garden fence and became so invasive that by the year 2000, African tulip tree was nominated as one of the 100 world's worst invasive species. African tulip trees invade agricultural areas, and in 2013 it was estimated that infestations cost farmers in Fiji over 1,300 New Zealand dollars per hectare every year. African tulip tree is also considered a major threat to biodiversity, for example by outcompeting critically endangered native plants, and even its flowers have a dark secret. They are adapted to be pollinated by birds and bats and are toxic to some insect pollinators such as stingless bees. The search for natural enemies began in 2009 when the Secretariat of the Pacific Community provided funding for researchers from Rhodes University in South Africa to conduct surveys of African tulip trees in Ghana. These surveys identified several potentially suitable control agents. In 2014, the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade funded a program that targeted invasive weeds in the Cook Islands, and this provided the additional resources required to complete work on 2 candidate agents. In the Cook Islands, African tulip tree is widespread on Rarotonga. Infestations in native forest are currently patchy, but you often find a halo of seedlings under established trees, and this indicates that over time individual trees will become patches that will slowly coalesce. The long-term prognosis is not good. The first agent released was an aerified mite called Colomeris bathodiae. The mites are tiny, about 1/5 of a millimetre long, but their feeding stimulates African tulip tree leaves to produce conspicuous galls, which are technically known as erynia, and these act as nutrient sinks. Specificity testing conducted in South Africa indicated that the mite will only damage African tulip tree, and in 2016 the mite was approved for release on Rarotonga. Rhodes University researcher Dr. Ian Patterson flew from South Africa to Rarotonga to release the mites in January 2017. They spread rapidly throughout Rarotonga and caused conspicuous damage. However, it was unclear if the damage was enough to control trees, and so work on a second agent, a shiny black flea beetle called Paradibolia cerulea, was progressed. Flea beetles are named that because, like a flea, they're small and have powerful back legs that enables them to rapidly jump and escape danger. The adult flea beetles are only about 2 to 3 millimeters long and feed on the foliage, causing relatively minor damage. The beetle larvae are leaf miners, and they consume a lot of leaf material during their development, and this is the damaging stage. Approval to release the beetle in Rarotonga was granted in late 2019. As before with the mite, a colleague from Rhodes University planned to fly to Rarotonga via New Zealand with a consignment of beetles. However, before the flights could be arranged, the COVID-19 pandemic began, and New Zealand locked down and cut itself off from the outside world in March 2020. Nothing could be done until February 2021, when an opportunity presented itself. Landcare Research hired a South African scientist, Dr. Alana Den Brien, who was due to fly to New Zealand to start work. We contacted her and asked if she would be willing to hand carry the beetles to New Zealand, and she agreed, and so the day before she flew to New Zealand, Pippa Musket from Rhodes University handed her a precious cargo of around 100 beetles. When Alana arrived in Auckland, she declared the package of beetles and handed them to the airport biosecurity team before she was whisked away to a managed isolation facility. I then drove to the airport to collect and transport the beetles to the Landcare Research Auckland containment facility. At that time, the Cook Islands border was closed to New Zealand residents, but Cook Islands residents were allowed to travel to New Zealand, and Cook Islands Ministry of Agriculture scientist Dr. Maya Pushko agreed to fly to Auckland to collect a shipment of beetles and return to Rarotonga to release them. However, on the 14th of February, 3 community cases of COVID-19 were detected in Auckland, and travel between New Zealand and Rarotonga stopped. This presented another problem. We only had a few small African tulip tree plants in our containment facility, not enough to maintain a big colony of beetles. Stephanie Morton, who took over control of beetle rearing, restricted beetle breeding to prevent them from eating themselves out of house and home, and slowly increased our capacity to rear beetles by taking cuttings to propagate more plants. In May 2021, community transmission of COVID-19 was again eradicated from New Zealand, and the Cook Islands border opened to all New Zealand travellers. We had to make the most of this opportunity even though we didn't have many beetles to spare, and on the 5th of June 2021, Stephanie Morton and I travelled to Rarotonga with just 66 beetles. After clearing customs, Maya guided us to a site that looked ideal, an almost pure stand of tall, mature trees with many seedlings in the understory. We didn't know how beetles would behave after release. A big fear was they would fly off in all directions, making it hard for beetles to find one another and mate. We decided to release 40 beetles on branches contained in cloth sleeves so that the first eggs would be close together. We liberated the remaining 26 beetles. When we returned 2 days later, we easily found several of the liberated beetles, and so we decided to free the remaining beetles from the sleeves. After 6 weeks, multiple larval leaf mines were present at the release site, and Maya found beetles in February 22, some 8 months after the initial release. We are confident the beetle is established on Rarotonga, and we have reason to be optimistic that the flea beetle will control African tulip trees, because the larval feeding damage is very similar to that produced by Uroplata girardi, another leaf mining beetle that was introduced into Rarotonga in 1969 to successfully control another major invader, Lantana camara. If the Paradibolia beetles perform as well as Uroplata, that the African tulip tree will have met its match and will no longer be a threat to Rarotonga's forests in the years to come.
Wow, what a mission that was. Yeah, we thought we had COVID times pretty hard, but look how all the effort that's gone into getting that to the Cook Islands and crossing all those impossible to cross borders. That was a very good effort.
Another example of success stories.
Yes, under trying circumstances, I might add. I'd like to welcome Mr. Dominic Sadler here with us. He is the Protege Manager. So he works with the French territories on invasive species work. And if anyone in the audience would like to ask questions in French, Dominic is here to get an answer for you. But first of all, he's going to introduce our next session, which is another regular feature of ours, which is called Out and About, where we like to take people around the Pacific and see what a particular country or territory is up to, and see what they've learned and how well they're doing. Everyone likes traveling. We're obviously not traveling anywhere at the moment, so this is a great opportunity to go somewhere without leaving your chair. Dominic, where are we going to go today?
So today in our Out and About segment, we're going to be heading to the Cook Islands, where natural enemies are being used to manage invasive weeds and strengthen climate change resilience.
Wow.
Oh yeah, there's some good ones here. That one looks like it's eaten. Permission to fire. Okay. Application complete.
I think the major benefit with using biocontrol is cost. Once these biocontrol agents are released out in the environment, you let them do all the work for you. So it's the cost at the beginning, but the maintaining of it becomes a no cost after that.
Biological control, or the use of natural enemies, is basically reuniting an invasive species with the enemies that help keep it in check in the native range. It's so invasive on many other islands. We can see that the same thing was about to happen in Rarotonga, and we wanted to introduce biocontrol agents before it became dominant.
The problem with the African tulip is it's competing with native plants that's growing on the hills. It also impacts in the forest area here on Rarotonga.
The seeds spread very easily, and you can find the trees everywhere in the mountain region. They outnumber easily native trees.
But once it does establish it can also spread through root suckers. And so that enables it to colonize forested areas.
This is probably one of the original trees where we released it. What we did is we were using the young growth and were covering with a netting to sort of have a sleeve over the branch. And we did that and released them the following day. We removed the sleeves, and about a week later we came to the same site and they were still in the same area hanging around, which indicated that the chosen releasing site was actually very good. So they stayed together, and the chance that they're going to multiply was pretty high. So they seem to be very happy in this climate.
There's a large number of invasive species, probably about 300 exotic species that have naturalized on Rarotonga, which is slightly more than the number of native plant species. But about 40 of those are considered to be serious invaders.
But a few people don't see because it's out of sight, out of mind. It's up in the mountains and they don't really see the impact it does to our environment.
Yes, I mean, many of the invasive species affect ecosystem services, and perhaps the most important one in Rarotonga is the water supply. And that's because the entire water supply of Rarotonga is from a handful of streams. Native trees in the forested areas are what's holding the soil together. They have very dense interlocking roots. And if those trees get smothered by vines, the fear is that they'll die. Then those roots are going to start rotting away. And that's going to result in instability of the soil. And that'll have major implications for how much water can be retained within the forested catchments. With Milominate, a rust fungus was found in South America that introduced to the Cook Islands, and that basically causes all sorts of pustules on the leaves of the plant and reduces its ability to photosynthesize, and so it no longer grows as quickly and is no longer capable of outcompeting native species or crops.
Whether the bioagents actually do what we expect them to do means controlling the weeds in the long term, the African tulip trees. This is something maybe our grandchildren will notice compared to reports from years ago. The population or the density of the African tulip queens have declined.
People tend not to think long term, but I think biological control probably is the only long-term solution for many of these invasive weeds.
Well done, Cook Islands. What a stellar effort. So they're controlling quite a few weeds with natural enemies, and perhaps at this stage they would be one of the most progressive countries at this stage, working with natural enemies, and obviously having a great partner, business partner, Manaki Whenua Landcare Research obviously pays great dividends and certainly increases the safety and probability that the project will be successful. So it was a great team effort. Our next session, I would like to welcome Bradley Meyer. Mr. Bradley Meyer here into the Battler Lounge. He is the Chief 6 Project Manager. Thanks for joining us, Brad. He's going to take us into the Gear Tech Review, which is where we typically look at some type of gear which helps us do our work. Sometimes it can be quite fancy or quite new, but sometimes it might be quite old. So I'll leave it over to Brad to see what we've got today for you all.
Thanks, Dave. I really enjoy the opportunity to introduced a gear tech review. I'm happy to admit that I'm a bit of a gear freak. I love using high quality tools to get the job done right. But as we've just seen, the Natural Enemies Natural Solutions program is different to other types of weed management. With Natural Enemies, we have critters doing the work for us. So today's gear tech review is not about some fancy new gadget. Today we're off to Vanuatu, where the biosecurity team have developed low-cost, low-tech, but highly fit-for-purpose solutions to help with their Natural Enemies program.
The work of natural enemies in Vanuatu is very important as it is began in 1935 with the introduction of natural enemies of Lantana camara.
Biological control work involving natural enemies can be carried out in any Pacific country using very simple facilities. It is not an expensive facility to build. So very simple materials and very simple designs are used. In Vanuatu, all the facilities that we've built, approximately it didn't cost more than 3,000 New Zealand dollars or 200,000 Batu. So this is the shed house that we have built. It is a very simple design. During disasters, for example, cyclones, we can just unscrew the fasteners and then roll out the shade cloth and pack it away during the cyclone, and then after that we can put it back on the frames. From the plants that we've grown in here and the biological control agents that we imported, they're in the post-entry quarantine that is in this building. So once the biological control agents are there, and we bring these plants into the biological control agents to feed them.
So ideally, when Pacific countries receive new shipment of natural enemies, they will initially go into secure post-entry quarantine facility in country for an additional safeguard, at least for unpacking.
For some natural enemies, success will be best if they are reared in cages in a post-entry quarantine. The conditions are controlled. Requirements for a post-entry quarantine facilities, it can be created from a single room and does not need to be large. So once we have a biocontrol agent, we bring our biocontrol agent to these cages. So we have our host plants from the greenhouse that we have planted, we put them inside and we release our biocontrol agent to these cages. So these cages are made from net to prevent the insects from coming out, and we have locks in them that they can lock up the doors so insect won't come out from the cages. So we have non-open windows such as this, and we have smooth surfaces, and the walls are painted in light colors. So we have ours in white. So if any insect escape from these cages, we can easily see them on these lighter surfaces. So after we reared them in these cages, the parent died, so we have the first generation. So we take the first generation and we release them into the fields.
The water icing weed that covers the waters around the Vanuatu, and in some of the islands, after the introduction of the natural enemies, which is a weevil, the population of the weed reduces a lot, and to allow organisms living under the water to take the fresh air, and they can breathe and they can live longer.
So, as you can see here, these are the 2 ponds that we use for the water hyacinth. This is a aquatic weed for water hyacinth, and we have biological control agents on these ones. We keep them here. Once we find patches of water hyacinth in rivers or ponds, we come here, we collect the biological control agents, and then we take them and release them to the sites where there is no biological control agent. So as you can see here, all these dots are signs that the biological control agents cost.
it does not eradicate the total amount of weed that is in the field, but it lowers its population. And also the work of natural enemies is always environmentally friendly and is often highly cost effective, and it poses no health risk for handlers.
Another great example of low cost, low tech, but fit for purpose. Well done, Vanuatu. What a team. How many of them were in there working together? Like 6 or 7. They're lovely people, that team. They've visited us here, most of them several times. And they're very hard workers. And they're doing a very good job. We miss visiting them and them visiting us. But well done, Vanuatu. And again, thanks for all of the people that are assisting Vanuatu with their Natural Enemies, Natural Solutions program. We have just a couple more sections left today. The next one is our spotlight for the session, which looks at something new or something we need to focus on, which will be of benefit to everybody out there. And I'll leave Joseph to kick that off with us.
Yep, thank you, Dave. So our spotlight for today, Temo Talia, our Natural Enemies Natural Solution Coordinator, will do a short live demonstration on how you can use the newly developed NENS option website to find out what weeds and agents are found in your country. The NENS option database is one of the new additions of tools and resources in our Battler resource base that can help you with your program of works, research on priority species, or simply manage your invasive species project independently. So over to Timo.
Whaftai Joseph, thank you for the opportunity to share today. Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Timo Talia. As Joseph mentioned, I'm the Pacific Natural Enemies Natural Solutions Coordinator here at Manaki Whenua Landcare Research, coming to you guys live all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today I'll be sharing with you a quick demonstration on how to use the new NENS option site. This has been developed to help people in the Pacific to access information on weeds and natural enemies that have been introduced to the Pacific region. Yeah, without further ado, I'll share my screen quickly. To get to the site, you can use the URL nensoption.com on any browser of your choice to get you directly to the site. An alternative route would be to go through the Battler resource base and use the link there to take you to the site. For the purposes of today's demonstration, I'll be just going through 3 quick examples of how the types of searches you can use. So you can, if you're interested in finding out what weed species are present in a particular country or in a particular country, you can use the Pacific Weeds database. Click on the drop-down menu for country. For this example, let's use the American Samoas. It's the top of the list here. Click on search. This will return results on all available, all weed species that are showing as present in American Samoa. Another useful search option is the NENS releases. So this can provide you with information on all natural enemies that have been released in a particular country. So for this example, let's use Fiji. So you just click on Fiji in the drop-down menu, click on search, and then this will return information on all natural enemies that have been introduced to target particular weeds in Fiji. It provides useful information in the form of an info sheet there on the particular weed that was being targeted, the type of introduction, whether it is intentional, and also it shows you whether the natural enemy has established in the country. The final example that I have for you today is if you're interested in finding natural enemies for particular weed species, you can use the NENS option search. Here, I'll use an example that most of us are familiar with. You can just type in the scientific name of a weed like Lantana camara. And this will return results of all available, all natural enemies that have been used to target Lantana camara in the Pacific region, and it will also outline its effectiveness in the Pacific region. It just takes time to load. Sorry, my computer's a bit slow today. So it just outlines all that information that I mentioned earlier. This is just a snippet of what the site is capable of doing. We're currently working on putting together a comprehensive step-by-step guide to show you how to perform more advanced searches, and we'll have this up on the website. At the moment, we're working on refining a lot of the details of the site, so we welcome feedback from our community here, and we're hoping to keep building on this so it become a tool that will be very useful to the battlers out there. Yeah, thank you very much. Joseph.
Thank you, Timo, for that quick demo. I really encourage people to check that out, and particularly look up and see what biocontrol agents or natural enemies are in your country and which ones potentially you may be interested in using, which are available already around the Pacific or around the world. We'll most likely have an individual session on that database at some stage, so we'll keep you posted. Right, the last little section we have for today is something that we're just embarking on. It's something that we have been wanting to do for many years, and finally, with funding from the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we are going to have a really robust look at trying to prioritise weeds in the Pacific, which we should focus on for finding new natural enemies. So some of the plants, as you've seen today, already have natural enemies existing, which can be moved around. But here we're talking about new research, going and finding natural enemies in the country of the weed's origin and doing the research and testing to try and enable them to be used in the Pacific once they're found. So it's quite a process. The key challenge, as Lindley mentioned in the very first video we saw today, is that there are a lot of weeds. We can't tackle them all at once, and we need to make really good decisions about which ones we want to target first and how we want to go about it. So we really need to identify which weeds are causing the most harmful impacts right now and which pose the biggest threat in the future. We need to consider how climate change might affect our strategy. For example, as expected, as Quentin said in the video, that vines might become more invasive under climate change than some other types of plants. So we need to take all these things into consideration. So we're really looking to see which ones we should start from scratch on, and where the greatest need is. And we really need the Pacific to help us come up with those priorities. We all have ideas of what we think priorities are, but also in the Mentimeter session that Bella put up, one of the most things was that the community and people were aware of what was happening. So we certainly want to go about it in that way. So the way we're going to do that, we were initially going to have in-person meetings, and I'm still very much hoping that we will be able to have a regional meeting next year to perhaps go over and solidify the results, but we're going to have to start to prioritise before then. So we're going to try and do a lot of it online through 4 or 5 sessions. And we'll be in touch with our key focal points in all the countries and territories for them to determine who in their country would be best to participate in that. We obviously need input from people who focus on the environment, agriculture, health, all those types of things. So there'll be a separate email coming out about that. But for now, we really want to get the ball rolling while we've really focused this Battler Lounge on weeds and one of the best solutions for managing them. We'd like you to consider a few things and provide us with some feedback to get us started, if you would. And of course, we're going to do that with Mentimeter. If you hadn't guessed that already, I'm going to jump back over to Bella, and we're going to go through a few more questions. And we're getting really close to the end of the session. So thanks very much.
Very much, Dave, and thank you, Wayne, for putting that on. Again, this is the last exercise that we will be doing on Mentimeter. So the last joining on to the same URL and using the same code that is at the top of the screen. And judging from all the hearts that are flying on the screen, Dave, we've got a good number of participants already on. So we'll move on to our next slide. So this one is on the invasion curve and talking about future scenarios. Our first question is, how many weeds are currently at low levels in your countries that could become a greater problem in the future? So our data here, Dave, Brad, we've got more than 10 and 5 to 10. That's the range of low-level weeds that are present in their countries at low levels, but our participants think are going to become a greater problem in the future. Brad, what is your interpretation of these results?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons why weeds might be at a low level today, but become real problems in the future. Common weeds may not be causing problems, so you may not be necessarily aware of them, but because of climate change and lag phase, there's a lot of reasons that they may become issues in the years to come.
Great, thank you for that, Brad. Our next question, please, is how many species of weeds do you think are getting worse each year? So again, the same values and that you can choose from. And right there, instantly, more than 10 is the number of species of weeds that our participants think are getting worse each year.
Yeah, so this is like, you have this thing called lag phase. And so as something's introduced to a place, it takes a while to get going before it builds up. So it's quite typical to find things that are currently in the lag phase, which then go on to become really common and really problematic.
Almost by definition, every weed will be getting worse each year unless it's being managed. So
scary stuff, right?
Yeah.
Next slide, please. How many species of weeds do you think have now invaded all suitable habitats? Joe, and you've talked about one of your worst weeds on the African tulip. What are your thoughts about the extent of the suitable habitats that the African tulip has extended itself to?
Well, I can speak from experience, like based here in the situation here in Samoa. Tamaling is definitely a species that's going out of range, out of touch. It's dominating all our catchments, especially on areas that highland areas. So there's also quite a lot of other species that are becoming invaders. So if I take this quiz, I would say more than 10, which is seems to be reflecting on our screen at the moment.
Absolutely. Moving on to our next question. So the following, we will be talking about the different climate change impacts, and these are expected to make the weeds more invasive in the future. So we're going to ask you to vote whether you agree or disagree, or yes or no to the following questions. Next slide, please. So our first question is, do you think the increased amounts of carbon dioxide will make weeds more invasive in the future? A popular answer here is yes. Next question, please. This one is targeted on the rising temperatures as a result of climate change. Do you think rising temperatures will make weeds more invasive in the future? We got some fast responders here, Dave. Instantly, we've got 25 yeses.
Well, I mean, any kind of disturbance is going to benefit a weed. And if temperatures or CO2 are all rising, that means that native vegetation will need to adapt to be able to compete with plants that by definition are likely to be able to survive and thrive in a wider range of environmental conditions.
Right, fantastic. Next slide, please. Do you think that changes in rainfall patterns, either increased or decreased, will make weeds more invasive in the future? You know, again, this is something that Dave said about adaptability is, you know, weeds are more adaptable to the changing conditions. And so that becomes unfavorable to the chances of survival for our native plants. Next slide, please. Will the increasing intensity of cyclones make weeds more invasive in the future? Joseph, and I hate to come back to you again, but you did talk about your experience with the Tamalingi before and after Cyclone Evans. What are your thoughts with this question?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, you know, our survey found out that definitely there's an increase of invasive species after cyclonic events or extreme weathers. So the facts are there, and I would say yes to this based on that those facts that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Joe. Moving on to our next question. Will the reduced efficacy of conventional control measures, such as the use of herbicides or mechanical clearance, make weeds more invasive in the future? So Dave, this one really points out on the efficacy of, you know, the use of herbicides on weeds and how that would impact the increase or decreased invasiveness of the weeds, right? And again, our participants do agree that yes, the reduced efficacy of these measures will impact on, you know, how aggressive these weeds will become in the future.
Yeah, I think it's probably perhaps the most debatable question that we've seen so far with 20 to 5. I don't think we've had as high as 5 for the. I haven't actually ticked yes or no for this one because it is quite a question actually. I think if control methods reduce in effectiveness, then, you know, they will continue to spread. Whether that will change will depend on, there's quite a lot of factors, I guess, whether to say yes or no to that question in my mind, but it's a question for everyone and it's probably perhaps not the most clear-cut question we've received on this one.
Thank you, Dave. I think we're coming towards the end of these questions. Do you agree or disagree that reduced efficacy of biocontrol will make weeds more invasive in the future? So of course, if biocontrol measures do not end up being as effective as we want them to be, then yes, that's more chances of invasive weeds to dominate.
I guess it's interesting to think about the effects of climate change on the biocontrol agents as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's one of those that there's probably quite a lot of factors. It's a little bit more debatable. As we can see, there's 8 people have disagreed. Again, I hate to admit it, but I haven't chosen either one. I'm kind of can't decide on that one in 2 seconds.
I think the questions are getting a little bit harder to decide on as we go. Next question, please, Wayne. So this one, Dave, as you talked about before, is on building the master list of weeds for prioritization, which will be discussed in a future workshop, and as well as the other meetings and events that will be happening very soon. Next slide, please. And the first question for this is, what weed or weeds impact mostly on food security? You know, this goes back to our discussions in the beginning about, you know, having different areas that invasive species impact on, and how different people can be affected. And so the purpose of this is trying to see what is bad for what areas in, you know, climate resilience. So we've got a number of responses here, which include the dominance is the Myremia, taro vine, and African tulip tree that we have talked about today, Dave.
Yeah, interesting selection there. I see Myremia is up there, and a couple of times, about a couple of different ways, possibly 3 different ways, which is very interesting. I mean, it still hasn't been fully determined where it is expected to be native and where it's supposed to be non-native. I know that the team from Landcare are working on that, but that will be quite an important thing to determine to progress that. I can, just from traveling around the countries, most of these plants here are not surprises to me that people have chosen these.
Right. Our next question, please, Wayne. This question is targeted towards the health and resilience of native forests. So please, we're asking our participants to identify what weeds impact the health and resilience of our native forests.
You only get one choice for that one.
Yeah, but
I need about 30 choices.
I'm sorry, Dave, we will make sure to make multiple entries on the next Mentimeter sessions.
There's a good one. Look, all weeds.
Right, and the popular one again here, Dave, is our African tulip.
Yes, well, it impacts so many different sectors, which is why there's so many different organisations that are interested in managing it in the past and moving forward to the future. It's one of those things at this stage. It looks like, luckily, we may have something that may perhaps make it manageable. So it's certainly one that I follow very closely, and I know how much African tulip is around the Pacific and how many countries could benefit from NEMS, and it's one of those ones that I guess is probably one of the easier ones to introduce natural enemies for, because of the type of little critter that you need. Yeah, for me, it's definitely one of my favourite options at the moment.
Thanks, Dave. Moving on, as we said, we've got quite a few areas that we want to get your response on. This one is on storms and cyclones. What weed or weeds cause the most harm during cyclones? And we have talked about those examples. And, we have our first ones there. It's the taro vine, tamalingi, and the African tulip. If somebody said all weeds, which is,
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, the thing is with weeds, some of them impact different stages of regeneration. So we have some ground covers, for example, like Singapore daisy or Wedelia, which reduce the germination or the regeneration of native species. We have Remia vine, which can also come in and smother over young plants which are trying to recover after a cyclone. That's been evident in quite a lot of countries. Gorse.
Thank you for that, Dave.
That's an interesting one. That must be from New Zealand. Gorse.
What weed impact most on human or animal health? Lantana.
There's a few scientists out there, I can tell. Lantana's a good one. So.
Joseph, there's some, and this is the example from Samoa on one of the weeds, which is why people don't want to have a NINS or a eradication program on the fuifosina. What's that one in, what's the common name for fuifosina in, is that the mile minute?
Mile a minute?
Yeah. Which is why a lot of people just, as soon as we talk about, addressing weeds and stuff, they drop the whole idea of it because there's one plant that they've found, they have a use for. But, the NINS program is a great example because it's not the eradication of the plants, it just controls its presence without the domination aspect of things.
We can still have the plants, but
yeah,
they just don't need to damage everyone else's plants.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your responses. Moving on to our next question. What weed or weeds is the hardest to control with existing tools?
Oh, that's an easy one.
Taro vine. The pond apple is another one. But the taro vine seems to be the popular one from the responses there.
The problem with taro vine is you do need to use quite an aggressive herbicide. As Lily points out, she called it scorched earth. So when you control taro vine with a herbicide, you need to use something with picloram or triclopyr in it. So that impacts any tree really, and the taro vine actually roots into the tree. So as soon as you spray that, it goes through, it kills the tree that it's in, dies. So it makes it very hard to control, and it's just so fast and climbs up really high. There's a lot of reasons why taro vine is really hard to control.
For me, it's if you chop it and deal with what's on the ground, but what's up in the tree continues to grow.
That's right. So normal vines, normal vines, you can just chop it and then just deal with the stuff on the bottom. The taro vine, yes, it's a beast on its own.
Yeah. So a NINS program will be, so essential. Good to not have to deal with those issues. Thank you, Wayne. Our next question, please. What three weeds might become the most serious new problems in the next 10 to 20 years?
That's another interesting question. I think it's going to depend a lot on which country you're in and which plants. You look at, for example, at the moment in Tonga, they're looking at the Panama rubber tree, which we didn't really know that was there until about 6 or 7 years ago. But they've just done a delimiting survey on that, and the invasion has a radius of about 5 kilometres from memory. So that's certainly going to be one.
got an umbrella tree response, lantana still there with African tulip and the tamalingi as the favorite or most popular response from our participants.
We don't have taro vine. That's interesting. I mean, most countries have taro vine. It hasn't been recognised as a potential weed yet.
Our participants have also provided aquatic weeds. And I think the case studies from what happened in Papua New Guinea, it becomes really concerning when you realize the extent that they can grow to. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for your responses. Moving on to our next question, which is also our last question. In one sentence, can you please tell us what you have learned from this event? Or if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the text box that's being provided on Mentimeter. Well, guys, it has been, we have run over time a little bit, but if you ask me, it's been really well worth it, to get the feedback from our participants, and, it'd be really good to provide and see where we continue on with what's been provided from them.
Yeah, it's a great start, and there's certainly a lot of food for thought. But we do have to move on. Thanks to all of you today for joining us and for your inputs and the Mentimeter. That's going to be very beneficial. I'd really like to thank everyone involved in this, particularly those who put a lot of effort into making today possible. First of all, I guess, is our battlers from around the Pacific who have shared their experiences today, particularly from the Cook Islands and Vanuatu, Niue, Samoa. I'm bound to have left someone out there. Anyway, if I have, I'm very sorry, but great thanks to you. And particularly the team from Manaki Whenua Lankia Research, Lindley, Quentin and Timo, and their collaborators, particularly Michael Day. They are PRISM's partners for NENS, and they're doing some great work, as you can see, in the Pacific, and they have a lot of great work coming up. A huge thanks to New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade through their MISCAT project, which is Managing Invasive Species for Climate Change Adaptation in the Pacific. Thank you very much. They provide a lot of resources, not just for PRISMs here for us to operate and operate the Battler Lounge, but also to our partners and the countries that we're working with. They're great supporters of us. Thank you very, very much. And of course, my team here, you can see 5 of us, but there is a lot more than that. We have Wayne, our tech guy, who's just sitting over here from me, busy, and William and Jordan, who is assisting from the outside of here. We've been really privileged and thankful that you could join us. A lot of information you can find about natural enemies is on our Battler resource base. We have a Battler guide, which is a great introduction. We have 5 sessions, videoed sessions on natural enemies and creating a program, and a lot of other information. And please do check out the NENS options database. That information has been around for a little while, and we first provided it to the Pacific at a 2016 film meeting. But at that stage, it was an Excel sheet, which Michael Day, bless his soul, put so much work into that. Finally, it's in a format which is a lot more usable. I shouldn't say a little bit, it's a lot more usable. And now you can pretty much ask it what you want or what you need to know, and it'll tell you straight away. So please look up those resources. Please get in touch with us if you're interested in having a natural enemies program. we're here to help as well as our prisons partners. So again, thank you everybody and take care. Thank you.